Hey, welcome to the Thrivecast. It is a production of the Thriveal organization, and Thriveal has been around, going strong for almost 15 years, where firm owners come from all over the world to build community and grow and build their firms together through our programs, events, education, and conferences. And we want to say thank you to Bill. They are a sponsor of the Thrivecast and have been for many years. We're actually a 15-year user of Bill in our firm. So thank you, Bill, for helping us as we deploy Bill into a lot of our controllership and CAS work with our clients all across the country. Thank you, Bill, for being a sponsor of the Thrivecast. Hey, everybody. I'm excited to welcome you to another Thrivecast podcast where we have a lot of interesting people teach us about, things happening in the world. And I have Katrina Nacci, a CPA in Frankfurt, Germany, actually, that's going to teach us a lot. But she's from the U.S. and she has a lot of cross-border accounting experience, GAAP conversions, IPO readiness for European companies. So it's going to be a great conversation. And she started with PwC in Boston doing some of this work before transferring over to Frankfurt and then Dubai for a time. And now she does this work full-time on her own. And we're going to figure out all that she does and how she supports, I think, European companies getting ready with US GAAP as they go into the US. So we're going to learn all about that. So Katrina, thank you for coming with us on the Thrivecast. I appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me, Jason. Really looking forward to the chat.
Yeah, very cool. So the work you do now, you did start doing it at PwC, right? This cross-border accounting, and what would you call it? You redo accounting systems? No, that's probably the wrong way to say it. How would you say what you do generally?
I mean, I like to use the kind of cheesy line, I think we're talking with other accountants mainly here. So bridging the gap, with 2 A's is basically what I'm doing. So I'm taking companies mainly from local accounting standards in Europe, either up to IFRS or US GAAP, to bring in US investors, either because they just did a big fundraise or they want to go public in the US, or they're, thinking of getting acquired by a US company. So the GAAP conversion work is kind of my bread and butter now.
Okay. And that's what you started at PwC, right?
So when I was working for PwC in Boston, right out of college, I was just in the standard audit function there. So I was auditing public companies in the US, mainly tech companies, a couple of aerospace and defense and other interesting things, full scope PCOB audits, and then some kind of startup companies as well. So I think that adds a lot to my experience because I can come at it from all angles. I've been with PwC in more of an advisory role. I've been with them in audit, and then I've also spent a few years in industry. But when I moved over to Germany, I actually left PwC briefly because I always wanted to live in Europe for a little while, and I was actually recruited to work for a joint German and US listed company to do their SEC reporting. I didn't know anything about Germany at the time. I didn't know any German, but I figured, hey, I'll try it out for a year and see how it goes. And I've been here for 12 years now, so it's obviously worked out. But I actually ended up back at PwC as a local hire in Frankfurt, because before I left the Boston office, there was a quality review partner that put me in touch with one of the partners here in Frankfurt, just saying like, hey, if you ever need anything, just reach out to this guy, he'll help you, which I super appreciate. I actually just sent that partner a note last week, like thanking him for that.
Nice.
And so I ended up rejoining PwC in the capital markets and accounting advisory services. So that was where I really was working in that cross-border world. And they had this specialist team of other Americans, either local like I was or on secondment for a couple of years from the US, and we were really focused on helping European companies go public in the US or do accounting conversions when there were acquisitions across borders. So that's where I have the bulk of my technical experience.
Okay. And now you do all of this independently, really in your own firm. And I guess some of what you do is you compete with those large firms, right? Because obviously the big four do that very complex work, but here you are kind of competing with them. And I think, I mean, you go through a lot of podcasts and LinkedIn, and you talk a lot about you're just way more cost efficient to do that, and probably easier for those companies to do that with you. I guess, why is that? What do you cut something out of the process that those big fours make them go through, or?
No, well, I mean, I guess to some extent because I don't have the overhead of dealing with the multiple layers of staff and the partner review, it's me, you get what you pay for, and I'm the expert. You don't have to deal with anybody else. But I guess to peel that back a little bit more, so I've been working for myself for about 3 years. And in that time, I've already kind of pivoted and changed my positioning quite a bit in that time. So initially, when I was just starting out, I knew I wanted to specialize in this cross-border work and kind of have clients in both the US and in Europe and be able to go back and forth and basically make it sustainable for me to stay out here from a personal perspective and be able to still go visit my family. But I was just kind of calling myself, a freelance accounting advisor and kind of specializing in cross-border work. And I initially thought that my business model was actually going to be to work through other accounting advisory firms when they sometimes had international clients, but they didn't really have expertise in-house. So that's what I started doing. But I pretty quickly realized I didn't want to white label myself because my experience was so unique, and I started to bring in my own clients that way. And still I've kind of pivoted and figured out more specifically how to message myself and what I'm doing. So to answer your question, initially when I took that pivot and I was bringing in my own clients, I did kind of view those bigger advisory firms as my competition, but I actually don't as much anymore. I think that we should just kind of, be staying in our own lanes, I guess, for lack of a better term. Like, they're much better suited for some of these big conglomerates that really need a team of, 5 or 10 people to come in and overhaul everything for them. My sweet spot is really with scale-up companies and smaller companies, maybe 30 to 50 million in revenue, where they're just starting to think about going public in the US, or maybe they've done like a Series B fundraise and now they need to bring in US GAAP or IFRS and kind of bring more sophistication to their accounting and reporting for the first time. And at that stage, they typically, especially if they're just doing fundraising, it might be different if they're doing a public offering where they really need to build up the full finance team. But a lot of the times they can work really well internally with the resources that they have if they're skilled locally in their accounting and they have good people. And they don't necessarily need a full-time person that's an expert in IFRS or US GAAP, but they need somebody like on a fractional basis to take them through that one-time conversion process and then just help them with ongoing technical questions. And so that's kind of the model that I've built, where I try to leverage their internal team as much as possible to say, if you already know, if you're the expert in what you're doing currently, document that for me as part of my process. And then I don't have to spend time getting up to speed. And so I don't think it's that I'm necessarily like taking something away from the process that a bigger firm would do. I'm just trying to leverage their team more when I can to cut costs that way. And then I also break things very piecemeal. So, if you have to go through a 6-step process to get through a first time kind of US GAAP audit, I'm really only putting the proposal and the scope and the price together for that first bit. Let's get through that, figure out what's under the hood, and then go step by step. Whereas the bigger firms, they want to come in, they don't really want to leverage the internal team as much, and they want to do that full 6-step process up front because they need to kind of bring in those big fees to justify kind of the structure for how they work.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. Well, it matches like what we do in our firm sometimes when a client asks us to do CFO work or something like that. We'll have to figure out, well, do you have an accountant internally, right? Is there somebody we can lean on where we can do a lot of the CFO related work? So it sounds like you do that. You go, well, do you assess their accounting team, or do you interview them or something like that to figure out what their skills are? You have a checklist, because that'll tell you what you'll need to do and what you don't need to do, right?
I wouldn't say I formally do that in terms of like a GAAP conversion process. I would do that more formally if like for an IPO readiness assessment to make sure their team is structured to be able to report as a public company. But in terms of being able to leverage their team, it's just part of my proposal process is also education to like walk them through the files that I'm using in the process and what their auditors are going to want to see and explain to them, okay, within this file, either you can document how your consolidation looks and how it's mapped to your financials and what your current accounting policies are, I can come in and do that for you. And so obviously if they choose the route that they're going to do it, it's kind of caveated like, okay, I'm relying on the fact that, your documentation is correct and complete and all of that. But yeah, it still saves some time.
Okay. Well, so something you said, this is interesting. I don't know much about this international financial reporting world, and you know a lot about it. So if you're helping some European companies re-report in US GAAP, I guess, you probably could say that better than that. But then there are some companies that also get your help to get them IPO ready. And one thing you said is the team, of course, if they IPO and become public, now they have to have a whole different kind of reporting structure
Mhm.
to report through the SEC. And that's even different than if they just, do a conversion to US GAAP, right? So, and you help guide them on how to change their whole accounting department too. Or is that part of your service to help them with their accounting department, or you're just assessing that?
It would be part of the service. I think that assessment, like I said, it would be more in the IPO readiness. I think that it would be smart to have at least one person in there that's familiar with US kind of reporting, or
Yeah.
maybe like SOX, internal controls, that type of thing. But they maybe, especially because a lot of the smaller companies that I'm working with, they typically meet the requirements to be foreign private issuers, so they can report under IFRS and they don't have as much like quarterly and other reporting requirements. And a lot of the times they're also meeting the requirements as an emerging growth company, so they have some kind of scaled back requirements for reporting and like how long until they have to go through an audit of their internal controls. And so it's easier to have a little bit of a lighter team there, but I do see that quite often, companies in Europe coming to me that have already IPO'd in the past year or two, and they've had material weaknesses in their statements that like, hey, we don't have the right structure internally, and have tried to kind of use me, and they can to an extent. Even companies that I've taken through an accounting conversion, they can almost keep me layered in as a fractional chief accounting officer for technical accounting questions that come up. But I still want to make sure, if a company in Europe comes to me like that I'm working with them proactively to set up the right processes so that they can at some point handle it, or at least kind of fully own the plan. So I'm not just like a Band-Aid, I want to make sure that that's not happening.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you're originally from the U.S. Now, did you want to focus on Europe specifically, or you just had some opportunities to go to Germany, and then Europe became your focus, or was that
Yeah,
intentional?
somewhat. So I had taken a few trips with my family to Europe when I was younger and just always wanted to live abroad for a little while and experience different cultures and travel. I didn't really anticipate that I would necessarily stay out here for as long as I did, but now it just feels like home, and it was almost like a constant reevaluation every couple of years. Like, do I want to stay here, or do I want to go back and be closer to family and
Yeah.
work in like a more typical, I don't know, US either internal or back in an advisory firm role?
Hmm.
And so I'm not great at career planning either, to be honest. Like I've never really had a 5 or 10 year goal. But I've just made kind of small decisions along the way that allowed me to accumulate this experience that now kind of sits in that intersection where this is, basically the only thing that makes sense for me to do at this stage of my life, it feels like.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it seems like it's permanent now, right? So,
Yeah.
after 12 years, which is pretty cool. Now, when you started doing it, I guess when you visited initially, um, Germany, you didn't speak German then.
No.
I mean, did you run into some communication issues when you did start doing some of this work initially, or do most people speak English in Europe?
It was,
Doing this kind of
yeah,
work.
it was never a huge issue for me. So moving over here, working in an SEC reporting function, that's obviously all happening in English. And all the
Okay. Yeah.
PwC work that I was doing, because it was US facing, was also
Hmm.
all in English. So I guess formally speaking, the work's always been in English, but informally, of course, there's conversations going around in the office, or maybe even some of the documentation locally is in German. So that kind of thing was maybe a little bit of a struggle at the beginning. But now I'll never call myself fluent, but I get by. And I worked in private equity for a few years as well for a Toronto-based company here in Frankfurt. I was their first European finance hire, and I was in an office with 5 or 6 other people where I was the only like not native German speaker. And then also before I built up the team around me, I had to be like communicating with the bookkeepers and the property managers in German. So like that kind of threw me into the deep end a little bit. So like I can read lease agreements and like business contracts and things like that in German when I need to, but I still have like weird gaps in my vocabulary when, something happens with the plumbing in my apartment and I have to call my landlord kind of thing.
So specifics about plumbing or something like that
Yeah.
can trip you out. Yeah, that's pretty funny. Yeah, the business language probably is a little bit easier because that's what you're so immersed in. What do you like? Who do you like working with most? I guess when you sell, you work with scale ups, right? So these are probably founder led kind of companies, and they've grown so much. They're like the U.S. becomes a destination maybe for them, but you also run in probably to these huge conglomerate companies. Um, you did private equity there in Germany or in Europe. What kind of business do you like working with most? Is it one that actually gets what you do and finds a value in what you do, or what do you like?
That's a good question, the way that you phrased it, because getting what I do, I think if you're not in an accounting advisory role, can be difficult. And so that's why I initially thought that my business model would be a little bit easier to just sell to other accounting advisory firms and work through that because they instantly understood what I did. So it is a little bit more challenging to sell directly to a CFO, where, of course, the reason why they're bringing me in is because they've never gone through this process before and probably don't need to go through it again. But I really like working with scale up, I would say tech enabled companies, so tech SaaS, kind of other people in that space. That because they really see the value in what I do and they really like at that stage really need an advisor to guide them through that. And I really see that they value the work that I'm doing. I've done some work with bigger companies as well, which I like just to get exposure to that and kind of see the inner workings more. But a lot of the times they're kind of viewing me more as just like an extra set of hands and like, okay, we know we need this, go off and do it type of thing, which I'd rather be the one that's like controlling the process and explaining like this is what we need to do and kind of just running it
Yeah,
on my own in the background.
yeah, yeah. Do you like being just a standalone consultant, or would you rather work in teams? Because I imagine you get to work in teams. You're saying sometimes. Is there a preference to those, or does it just depend
Yeah.
on the contract?
I mean, I'm kind of working in a team to the extent that I'm communicating back and forth with their internal teams. I don't really have a team of people underneath me, which I'm kind of enjoying for the moment, given that I, built so many teams and manage so many teams with PwC and in private
Yeah,
equity, that it's nice to kind of not have that pressure at the moment, and I'm kind of just able to scale what I'm doing on my own. But
yeah.
maybe that changes in the future. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, building a firm around team is just much more complicated, so
Mhm.
it makes sense. And you do have such a specialty. They have to have you, they have to rely on you, so you can just hunker down and do that work,
Right.
which is cool. And so, is it true most of your work is taking European companies and re-reporting in US GAAP? Is that the biggest bulk of the exchange of what you do?
Yeah, it could be either US GAAP or IFRS because, like I said, there could be
Okay.
situations where they're allowed to do IFRS and still go into the US. So,
Okay.
yeah, I would be careful around, I guess, maybe the word re-reporting because that maybe comes with the implications that I'm kind of like erasing what they're doing right now and then like
Right.
rewriting it all. But of
Right.
course, they still need to keep like their local accounting statements intact for tax purposes. So it's
That's
typically
true.
like stepping up
Yeah.
and like creating a conversion ledger so that they can combine those two together and then start reporting into the US as they need to.
Okay, that makes it. Well, how does that practically look? It's not a, yeah, the way I said it, it sounds like it's another set of books, but it's probably not, right?
No, it's typically like layered in. So depending on the sophistications with the systems, I mean, a lot of times this is happening for the first time in Excel, but you would typically have like a ledger where you're reporting, say, like UK GAAP. And then they would create a separate conversion ledger that's like US GAAP adjustments. And if you just add those two together, I'm kind of simplifying it. But of course, that would be like your US GAAP ledger, because you always want to be able to reconcile between the two, because there's some like local tax obligations, VAT, sales tax, etc., that are still going to be on your US GAAP books. And you want to make sure you can like trace them back at the end of the day where those kind of balances came from.
Okay. So basically, when you do this work, you go through the full P&L and balance sheet, and you just know where I have to convert, I guess, and you are producing journal entries into their books of record.
So again, like producing the journal entries themselves is, I would say, like step 3 of the process. So a lot of the times I'm really just doing steps 1 and 2 for them, where I'm kind of laying out their chart of accounts, what types of transactions are going through each of those, how they roll up to the primary statements, and then set up a matrix of what are their accounting policies currently, what do they need to be under US GAAP, explain like specific to the company and the nuances of like what are the differences and how do you actually take those forward and quantify them. And then what I've started doing for the past year is holding I call it a GAAP summit, like a half-day workshop at the end of that, and walk their full finance team through this matrix of like explaining all the differences. And we actually pull up the supporting files for each of those line items real time and like work out, okay, how do you quantify those differences? So we're kind of both figuring it out together, and then it's good knowledge transfer for them. And then, I mean, they could use me for the journal entries, but at that point, they can also typically like take it away and kind of just do the journal entries themselves so that I'm not in the system.
That's cool. A GAAP summit. That's kind of cool. Now, do you ever go through that and explain it to them, and you don't get in fights with them, do you? They're like, do you get into disagreements? They're like, no, I don't want to do it that way. You're like, you have to, right? That's what GAAP. Like, do you bump into problems?
No, I haven't had any problems so far. I think that comes from, just they're starting to understand that they don't know what they don't know. And so they're, able to rely on me for that. But I'm also pretty practical about it. Like I just it was one of the smallest clients that I've worked with. And they came to me pretty early where I thought they weren't even going to be a client, but they wanted to proactively get ready for US GAAP before they did a Series B fundraise. Yeah. And so I had to find ways of working with them and like make it really pragmatic for them. So even in the summit, I kind of broke things down into like, these are things you definitely need to fix right now because they're even maybe under your current accounting policies not being done correctly, versus this is something you may want to fix down the road once you start to get an audit and they come in and they need memos, or like you kind of need to be a little bit more specific and deal with a smaller materiality. So there are certain things where I can point it out as like, yeah, this is a difference, but let's maybe do some back of the envelope calculations to show that it's not material right now, and you can just kind of monitor it along the way, and then at least you know how to deal with it at a later point in time.
Okay, that's cool. Well, so it's pretty proactive for, I guess, a founder, some kind of scale-up startup person to build a business in Europe, and it starts to grow, and they go, I want to launch in the US, and I want to go through a Series B. I don't guess they always know I have to have an expert like Katrina before I can get there. They just normally are thinking about raising money. Do they run into a wall and they actually have made some mistakes and they're like, I got to fix this. Now I can't get my Series B fund round. And so they hire you because they broke things? Or
I haven't seen that so much. What actually ends up happening more often than not is, I guess, the better situation where they're coming to me too early in the process that they don't actually need my help yet. So they will come to me to say, hey, we're setting up a US subsidiary. Can you help us? But at that point, if they're still, like UK headquartered, for example, and they're just setting up a subsidiary for sales purposes and that kind of thing, and they're not bringing in a big US investor that's requiring US GAAP, they don't need a full US GAAP conversion. They don't need to go audit in the US. So what they really need is just like a local bookkeeper and tax in the US, and I don't do that work. So I'm typically, I've built a network to be able to refer that out and then keep in touch, because likely they will grow if they're, moving into the US and maybe do something. But in terms of, putting together a Series B, a lot of times, especially when I first started out, when I was kind of getting my name out there and people didn't really know who I was, it was hard to get that traction. And so I would have a lot of companies coming to me after closing. So after the fundraise had already happened and they had signed on the dotted lines, and then they said, hey, we just did this fundraise. The investor agreement says we need to report under US GAAP. So like, let's just do it in the next couple of months. And I can do that. And it's typically fine in accordance with like when they need to produce their first audited financial statements. But I'm trying to advocate that it's better to get ahead of that where you can. And I think I've done a good job that I'm having companies come to me earlier in the process now. And because I break things into such piecemeal steps, you don't need to necessarily engage me already to put together full US GAAP financials and have all your audit documentation ready. But if you at least understand like qualitatively what the differences are, then as you're going through diligence, whether that's for fundraise or getting acquired, if you can speak intelligently to what are those differences and how you would handle them, I think that gives your US stakeholders a lot more confidence in your local team.
That's cool. Like, do you run into some common issues, common problems you find? Like, if you look at a set of European financials, you're like, I know where I'm gonna go to the asset section and find this problem. Are there some common issues?
I would say they're kind of all over the place. The bigger issue is actually, a lot of companies think that they can at least themselves kind of get a handle on what are the differences. Maybe if they look at like a PDF guide, some like Big Four publish, and a lot of them don't have local gaps to US GAAP. It's like IFRS to US GAAP differences. But the bigger issue that I find when I go into companies is that most of the differences I'm finding aren't even actual differences between the two gaps. It's issues of them applying their current gap correctly, like I said. And some of that is just, it's not necessarily an issue at that point in time. It's more just the sophistication of the company that it didn't require that. But that becomes then a little bit of an issue in the conversion process, especially if I'm like trying to document what their current policies are based on like what I understand the statutory environment to me. Sometimes there could be a disconnect of like what's documented that they're doing currently versus what are they actually doing currently.
I see. So their accounting department might not be as sophisticated, even just locally, as they may need to be, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Because the gap conversion, I mean, that specialty is something you can fully get done for them. So that's interesting that you find their accounting department may not be as fully buttoned up as it needs to be. But I guess a lot of startup founders don't really focus on their accounting department.
Right. And
I
it's
would
not
guess.
necessarily like, I don't want to make it sound bad. Like, it's not an issue with the skill of the team. Like, they understand,
Yeah.
even sometimes they pointed out to me that, like, hey, we're not doing this correctly right now. And
Right.
it's not even necessarily that it's incorrect. It's more just like, oh, it's not material yet. So we're not really tracking it to this level of detail. But sometimes they're even just, even though they know themselves that they need to change something currently, they'd rather have me put it into my documentation so that they can go and
I
present
see.
it to their founders and be like, hey, we need to invest in this and spend some time like
Okay.
building up the
Yeah.
team.
And so it's not even their skill. It might be they need a whole brand new role that leads some kind of maybe international related backup for this work. So I
Yeah,
don't
or
know.
just like more processes, people spending a little bit more time in the monthly
Hmm.
close process or
Yeah.
however that needs to work.
So you do a lot of the European gap conversions to US. Don't you work in the UK too? Do you report into the UK also a fair amount?
So most of my clients are actually in the UK. So,
Okay.
European gaps could mean various things. Every country here basically has their own gap. So I work a lot in UK
I
gaps. I
see.
also work in like German, Netherlands, Belgium, Austrian, kind of all over the place.
Oh God. They're all different.
Yes, I mean they have a similar flavor, I would say, in that they're not as sophisticated as a IFRS or US GAAP. A lot of times, for example, silly things like they're not capitalizing leases. It's not part of
Okay.
it. So I kind of understand when I go in there like what I'm looking for, but yeah, they're all different.
Have you had to learn them all, or you
Um,
just ran into them in your work?
Yeah, I think I've probably worked in like at least 10 different statutory gaps at this point between like the work I've done with PwC and then when I was in private equity, they were very acquisitive around Europe. I'll never say that I'm an expert in these local gaps, but you don't really need to be because, like I said, a lot of times companies aren't even necessarily following those to a T. So it's more important to just like get under the hood and understand what they're doing. It's more important to be an expert in like the gap conversion process, and then of course in the end standard that you're going to, so you can write those policies appropriately. So like
Yeah.
if a US company came to me and said they wanted to do a conversion to German GAAP for some reason, like I probably wouldn't be the person to do that.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. But you do have to understand, some of that as well. What how have you grown maybe as a person or a leader? And really, I keep thinking about communication. Different language barriers would sound so difficult, but have you recognized how you've grown doing this work on your own, especially?
That's a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. The language barrier is interesting because obviously I'm doing all of my work in English, and to some extent I can kind of justify it from a lazy perspective to say, hey, if a company is only writing up things in German, and then they probably aren't a candidate to work with me because if they want to go to the US, it needs to be in English. So that hasn't been as much of a big deal. Of course, I think my vocabulary and the way that I talk has probably changed because I deal with so many non-native English speakers. Whenever I go back to the US and see my extended family, they always say like I have a weird accent, things like that. But more broadly, as a leader and like how I communicate, when I came out of my last role in industry, I still considered myself just kind of like a dorky technical accountant. And I had to learn all of the other skills for the business, like business development, sales, marketing, etc. And I also consider myself to be pretty introverted. And so I thought that that was going to be a challenge for me. And I think at first it was, but now that I'm really niched in what I'm doing and I've just seen so much even in this short period of time, and the fact that I just really like what I'm doing and I'm really passionate about it, it almost makes those conversations a lot easier for me because it doesn't feel like stress ridden or make me anxious because I can just easily talk about these topics to whoever.
I see. Yeah, you don't have to sit there and talk about the frickin' weather with people. It's like you can
Right.
dive into gap
Yeah.
conversions. We work with a lot of founders, a lot of entrepreneurs. We're kind of a business firm, so we work with entrepreneurs, and they are always they're tough to support because they're always making crap up and they're always starting new businesses. And we find them on our side, they're just starting businesses because we're out of the US. They'll start businesses in Mexico or Canada and they go, that's no big deal. I had a friend there, so we started a restaurant. And we're like, no, that's a huge deal. Um, and so, that it is so hard to kind of support people that just branch out into, an international place and they don't know how important that is. So we're seeing our clients do that more. We even need more support on the tax side. And my question for you is that, do you think that's happening more that the world, people just think more globally, or do they have to go be global on purpose for a particular purpose or reason? I don't know how to ask that, but
Yeah, I think
it's happening more and more. We run into it
yeah,
seems.
I think a lot of times it's just happening naturally because people are working remotely a lot, and they want to work
Okay.
from different places. And sometimes, I run into a lot of even U.S. companies that are making acquisitions, and they're, even before they made those acquisitions, they had their finance team in, I don't know, like Romania or something, right?
Okay.
But I think even just for me personally, it resonates because I struggle with that myself. As a U.S. citizen, you're unfortunately always beholden to the U.S. tax code,
Yep.
have to file U.S. taxes, and so I'm running into the situation now where I don't have an entity established, and I'm just working under my own name as a registered freelancer in Germany. Because if I set up a German
Mm.
GmbH, there would be tax implications of me owning a foreign entity, and if I set up a U.S. LLC, then I've got to like take distributions out because I can't
Ah.
put myself on payroll as a foreign kind of resident. So it's like a little bit
Ah.
nuanced there and something I'm still trying to figure out, but it gives me a much better appreciation for like these larger companies trying to do that.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And how do you do the technology side, like the accounting technology side? I mean, we use US based accounting products, and I'm
Mhm.
sure there are accounting products in Germany for the German market. And if you're in all of these 10 different GAAP-based. Are you having to dig through their software to learn their software, or do you do a lot of it in spreadsheets and big Excel documents?
It's mostly spreadsheets. I have to be
Okay.
pretty system agnostic to do what I'm doing because there's already
Okay.
a pretty limited market of companies that I could work with. That if I was only going to work with companies that were in zero or something like that would just limit it too much. So
Yeah,
I typically don't have access to their systems, and they're just exporting things for me,
I
which
see.
works fine, and I can manipulate that. So I don't really need, in terms of my tech stack, like the standard accounting and tax products. The only kind of accounting product I have is IntelliGIS, which is this SEC research tool that I used at PwC. And it's very
I see.
expensive, but it's very helpful to help benchmark disclosures for public companies.
Very cool. Okay. Okay, this is good stuff. So, Katrina, I'm going to ask you some questions about Europe now.
Okay.
So I'm curious. So a lot of people in the US, they'll travel to Europe and they love it because you can get around, in a lot of different places in Europe. Is Do you get to travel throughout Europe? Even probably professionally, I guess you do, but personally too as well. Is that part of the benefit of being there in Germany?
Definitely. I'm probably traveling like once a month or every other month
Oh,
at least,
cool.
like either
Cool.
for work or a long weekend somewhere. So I go to London a lot for work, mostly London. I would say that's where most of my network is, and there's always conferences, so something going on there. Been to
Yep.
Paris for work a couple of times, but
Hmm.
otherwise, Frankfurt's also very centrally located, and
Yeah.
2 hour plane ride you can be in, I don't know, like 10 different countries, so it's very easy to get
Yeah.
around here.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, Katrina, thank you for hanging out with us on the Thrivecast. It's pretty fascinating. Most of the time we have U.S. based guests and they're just doing the work and growing firms. And you are growing a firm internationally, which is such a specialty firm. I think a lot of what you do is pretty unknown to a lot of the smaller accounting firms in the U.S. So it's pretty interesting. Would you say uh, the U.S. based accounting firms need to be more internationally minded, or would you have an opinion about what they should be thinking about as far as international work?
So I actually recently started a community of people doing cross-border work, kind of
Mm,
complementary to myself because it helps me to make referrals and get referrals. And so I
yeah.
have some like US tax and CFO people in there. I think for the most part, they're still focused like locally on what are the US rules. But I think the benefit of kind of realizing that you need that collaboration and being in those types of
Hmm.
communities is so that even ahead of running into a situation where you've got a client that needs help in another location, like you already have a way to get them the right help. I think, I realized, like I said, myself trying to deal with taxes. I've yet to find a person like me, for example, with tax that can do both my German and my US taxes. So I think a lot of times with things like that,
Yep.
you need to have separate providers, but you need to have a way to be
Mm,
able to talk to each other and at least kind of speak the same language and make sure you're getting your client like the best results.
yeah. No, that's interesting because we use an international tax expert to help our firm, but they do the US based work. We
Mm,
always have to make sure that client has their own person in that other country.
right.
And so that cross border stuff can be not only just confusing in doing the work, but you got to have a network of people on both sides really that can help you. And it sounds like you're even running into some of that with the US and German, starting your own
Yeah,
entity or not starting an
yeah,
entity. It's kind of can be confusing. So,
definitely.
well, cool. All right. Well, Katrina, how should people find out more about you? How can they follow you online?
Best way is just to go to LinkedIn. I think I'm the only Katrina Nacci on there, and I post pretty regularly, or you can also send me a connection request and we can chat there.
Yeah, very cool. Okay. Well, Katrina, thank you for being on the Thrivecast. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, very cool. Take care. Bye bye.